as expensive and as complicated and as aggravating as it is now. It used to not be at all, and um, it's tremendously expensive for people. A lot of people don't realize it until that moment that they're sitting there at the cemetery. So I always recommend for people to know, and if you have a spouse who passed away or a parent that you had to do, you may know this already, but until you actually sit there with it, it can be very enlightening, frightening, and also deeply disappointing and upsetting from the standpoint of how much these things cost. And do they really need to cost that much? So, anyways, I will say that on a happy note, definitely things are not as bad as they were a month ago. And gosh, I hope it stays that way. And so we're starting to talk about again, how we can start to look at maybe getting back to doing stuff live outside, doing some things maybe by the end of the school year for our kids to maybe have a live event. Remember, we've been virtual for our Hebrew school. We had our Hebrew school even today virtually. And it's been, it in a couple of weeks, it's going to be a year that we've been online. And I'm hoping that our kids will be able to go back to see, actually, if they can't come into the synagogue, maybe again, do something outside, do an event we're talking about maybe in May. So let's hope. They're talking about going back to school in Santa Clarita, by the way, the young elementary schools, Monday. They were supposed to be this Monday, and then they postponed it another week. So just having those kids go back to school, it's just K through 2 in most of the elementary districts, that if that happens, then that's a good step and a little bit of a step in the right direction. So we're going to get going. I think we have a couple people that are jumping on and that are not here yet. And again, I want to thank everybody who's here with us, who's not in Santa Clarita, because we've had a chance to bring in people from all over the place, and it's been great to have you all with us. And I mean y'all, because especially in Texas, we have to say y'all, to have y'all with us. And this is again one of the good things about having this time to be on virtual, is that we were able to do that. We had some new people that joined us on Tuesday, and a few times over the last a month or so, we've had some people jumping on, and we hope that they do that either on Facebook. I just got us live on Facebook, so we're going to get going. And I know at least the Wednesday nights, we tend to get a few people more on Facebook that join us. I would love for them to come on and be part of the discussion. I don't think we have Joyce yet. Is Joyce not going to be able to come on today? Do we know? I'm not sure. I don't see Joyce on yet.
She's yeah, she's dialing in.
Okay. But yeah, we've been getting a lot more people. Yep, we're on live now on Facebook. But we've been getting more people coming up. We've been getting people more doing the live on Wednesdays instead of not so much the Tuesdays, but anyways, so we're gonna get going. And again, hope everybody is is going to get through the next few days. And as I mentioned at the very beginning, tomorrow night is the new moon. I would probably not going to see you tomorrow night to wish you a good month, a Rosh Chodesh, a Tov, a good new month. But we will hopefully see you for Purim stuff. In case I don't mention it at the end, not next Thursday, but the Thursday after that, on the 25th, is the night that we're going to actually we're going to sing the Megillah, and we have an 80s theme for the Megillah. So that's going to be Thursday night. I'll remind people the next couple of weeks, but we're going to have our Megillah with Wendy. And we're working on that. We're taping some stuff. There's a whole lot of preparation, a whole lot more work that goes into it. She always spends a lot of work on it. She does an amazing job. But this year she is doing stuff ahead of time with our singers and performers, and it's going to be great. So we'll also put that up on Facebook so people will be able to see it. But yeah, it's going to be great. So let me bring up the page and have a chance to share that out tonight. Let's see here. We got Joyce. So we got everybody. Well, not everybody, but we got all you, which is what we need. So we're gonna share up the parsha, this week's parsha. Hey Joyce, we're gonna put up Mishpatim. We're going to get everybody the get to see this, which last week we read the story. We read not the story, the story leading up to getting the Ten Commandments, and then we read the Ten Commandments, and immediately after the Ten Commandments, the part that we read last week, we finished with, was some interesting laws in the last part of chapter 20. So the first part of chapter 20 is the Ten Commandments up to verse 14, and then 15 through verse 23, the end, is about kind of this interesting law about building altars, and kind of gives us a little bit of a taste of what we're going to get in next week's portion. And then pretty much the last 5 portions is all about construction of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle, the ark, all the things that go into the first Jewish worship space, public worship space. Up until that time, we've had individual family worship spaces, but now we're going to have communal worship spaces, which are again taken over by a professional group of priests. But even before we kind of get into the priesthood, the Levites, which is the next book of the Bible, Leviticus, we get into the Mishkan at the last third of the book of Exodus, is what we kind of shared before. If the first part of Exodus is about slavery and liberation, the next part, which we're in right now, is about laws. The last part is about connecting with God and creating places of holiness. So it kind of builds up that way, that where we're at right now, the laws are the swivel point, the pivot between redemption and connection is the law. The law is the connection between people who are going to find a way to connect. There's going to be rules for it, and interestingly, the rule of creating the sacred space is really the last part of what we read last week, is that kind of proof of that, which is that we get specific laws about creating the sacred space, which is the Mizbeach. And it's kind of an overlap between that idea of law and sacred space. So this week we get into Mishpatim, which literally means these are the rules. And that's what the word, the second word in the Torah portion, the second word in verse 1, the Ele Mishpatim, HaMishpatim, these are the rules that you shall set before them. And this definitely seems to be directed at Moses, whereas the Ten Commandments seems to be directed at, or it kind of says it's all the people are hearing this. Now, these are laws that Moses is now going to tell the rest of the people. So when we talk about like what's the difference between the Ten Commandments and the rest of the commandments, everybody says, well, those are the Ten Commandments. Those are the commandments that are the most important. Those are the ones that, were given at Mount Sinai. Well, all the laws are given at Mount Sinai. The Torah never tells us these are the most important laws. These are the only ones that you're supposed to follow. These are the ones that you should follow no matter what. The other ones are extra. That's not what the Torah says. What the Torah does kind of give us this understanding of is that those 10, everybody heard. And so what distinguishes the 10 commandments is that everybody heard them. The rest of the commandments are given, for the most part, through Moses and Aaron to the rest of the people. So that's really what differentiates the 10 commandments. It's the public hearing of them that makes them so significant, that everybody hears it. So let's take a look at Mishpatim. So the first law And again, we're going to stop and start because this collection of laws is very much like Deuteronomy, especially Kitetse, which is the portion that, as we talk about, has the most laws. There's over 70 laws in Kitetse. It's one law after another, and some of them are kind of like really not connected. It's a miscellany of laws. Mishpatim is very much like that too. There's a lot of different laws in here, not always connected to the previous law, and it's a kind of like the rest. We have the Ten Commandments, and now we're going to get into other laws that you also have to follow. It doesn't just end with the 10. So we'll stop and start. And this one is requires a little discussion or explanation. When you acquire a Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years. In the 7th year, he shall go free without payment. If he came single, he shall leave single. If he had a wife, his wife shall leave with him. If his master gave him a wife and she has borne him children, the wife and her children shall belong to the master, and he shall leave alone. But if the slave declares, I love my master and my wife and children, I do not wish to go free, his master shall take him before God. He shall be brought to the door or the doorpost, and his master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall remain his slave for life. So this is this weird law of slaves that come into your possession who, there's a lot to decompress and to take on here, because number one, it says right off the bat that this is a slave who is a Hebrew slave, which also again seems to indicate that this is not a person who is a slave that would come to you in kind of the ways that slaves oftentimes came to people through war. This is a slave that you would have acquired, or very simply, where it says when you acquire, it could be kitikne, which is the Hebrew, is when you purchase. The word kone means to purchase, which can also be acquire, but it doesn't mean you captured. It's very specific. It's not captured. It's something that you purchased. It also seems in to some extent that you can't capture you can't purchase or acquire somebody who's a Hebrew for longer than 7 years. And so we sometimes call this kind of indentured servitude. This is what many cultures had, including, of course, part of English law up until the 1800s. I mean, if you want to see a version of that, you can watch some movies about Irish indentured servants and people who were kind of brought to this country, America or Australia. I'm not talking about the prisoners that were brought to Australia, but if you look at the history of America, there were people who came to this country, especially from Ireland, who were brought here as kind of indentured servants, who were Irish or from parts of England that were not from Africa or from the Caribbean, who were that were essentially working off debts or working off crimes, that servitude was their punishment, because we didn't have jails. We didn't have places where people would be able to serve out punitive sentences. So they would, in some cases, they'd have to be serving as kind of a debt, serving out a debt. One of the movies that touched on this that came out actually about 30 years ago now, is Far and Away with Tom Cruise, where he plays a Irish guy who who essentially is put into indentured servitude. Um, and this is the basis for kind of what was American law for a long time, that debts, including bankruptcies, would have a maximum time of 7 years that you could be under those kinds of penalties. And so this is a strange law in that it's not a slave that you would have purchased. Essentially, there's two categories of slavery in Judaism and from the Bible and later on in the Talmud. It's an Eved Ivri and an Eved Canaani. There's only two distinctions. Either you're a Hebrew slave or a Canaanite slave. And a Canaanite slave essentially is anyone who's not a Hebrew slave. Or a Jewish slave, which also kind of begs the question that if somebody converted to Judaism, would they immediately at that point become an Eved Ivri, a Hebrew slave, and then would they be able to be freed after in the 7th year? So the reason that this is important from a historical standpoint is perhaps one of the reasons why Jews didn't convert their slaves was because if they did, essentially they were on a clock ticking out 7 years from the time the person would have converted. So could slaves have converted knowing that, learning Jewish law, being told that? Yeah. And the Talmud essentially says if somebody does that, you have to free them. On the other hand, if they're only converting because they want to be a freed slave, that's also not a grounds to go through conversion. So there is that little catch. But you could say, hey, I wanted to be a Jew. And so that could be one of the reasons why Judaism why Jews did not convert their slaves. Another reason why Jews didn't oftentimes have slaves is the Torah and later on the Talmud puts very strict laws on the way slaves are being treated, not just Hebrew slaves, but Gentile slaves as well, that they had to be treated with care and with laws to protect them, to the extent that, like, if you're running low on food, you have to serve your slaves before you even serve your own family. So the laws become really, really strict on the way people would treat their slaves. And again, Judaism really didn't encourage it. However, there are obviously situations where slavery was not only accepted, but kind of there really was no other choice, especially with crimes and with punishments where essentially there was either you get beat, you get killed, or maybe the least bad option, if you will, was to work out your servitude in as a slave. I mean, one can make the argument, take the beating, but maybe that only lasts for a little bit, and then you have scars left over. But they could beat you pretty hard too. There's a maximum, by the way, on beatings, but again, those were really the only choices because there were not prisons. You couldn't just put someone in prison and say, oh, he's in prison doing his time, or she. So also, of course, as you can see, you had to support the person's wife. He had to be protected, as well as his family had to be protected. And again, it still begs the question, how could people who just got liberated from slavery be talking about slaves? There is that issue, which we do have to address. It doesn't seem to make sense. But I will tell you, the reality is that it just was a foregone conclusion there was going to be slaves, because again, they didn't have really any alternatives for taking people captive, for dealing with punishments, for dealing with debts. There really was no other way to do this. I'm not making excuses for it. I'm just telling you the facts, that every culture had this, and they had to figure out ways to live in this system where this is what people did. It's kind of hard to believe that the Israelites would have had slaves in the wilderness, but the laws could have been put in place for when they're in the land and these kinds of things are able to happen. And there are rules for it. And immediately we get these rules for the way we take care of slaves. Or again, indentured, and definitely in this case, it's a little bit more indentured servants. And finally, again, the idea that people are not supposed to be slaves forever, which Jews are definitely not supposed to be slaves forever, which is why we have this weird law about having this ear pierced and having a way to mark people who've made that decision, which seems also somewhat violent and difficult. But again, it really is telling people, don't do this. This is not something that people should do. If they want to do it, we have to allow them to do it. But it's not something, again, that we're encouraging people to do. Look, it you know, people talk about anthropologically why this, you know, having them have their ear pierced to the house is essentially like they're owned by the house, they're part of the house now, you know. But I have had people tell me that this is why men shouldn't have their ears pierced in Judaism, is because it was a symbol of being a slave in Jewish tradition. That having an ear pierced would have been not something that you should do. So we have that law there. Any questions or comments about the slave or the ear piercing? Again, this is going to continue a little bit with the next law, which is a little bit more of about slavery and a weird situation that people would also get into. When a man sells his daughter as a slave, she shall not be freed as male slaves are. If she proves to be displeasing to her master, who designated her for himself, he must let her be redeemed. He shall not have the right to sell her to outsiders, since he broke faith with her. And if he designated her for his son, he shall deal with her as is the practice with free maidens. If he marries another, he must not withhold from her one food, her clothing, or her conjugal rights. If he fails her in any of these three ways, in these three ways, she shall go free without payment. Now, again, on the face of this law also seems exceptionally harsh and really not very fair, and not a good situation for a people who just suffered slavery. Again, I'm just going to sound like I'm making excuses here, but the reality is that these laws are actually very progressive and very protective of human rights for the times that they were written. Very much so, because essentially, if the man who essentially owns this woman doesn't treat her, she's definitely not a wife, but she's also not just a slave. And there is this sense of responsibility that he has for her that's very, very serious, and that she is basically protected there, that she has rights. Now, again, well, of course, she's a human being, but she's also in a category at a time throughout much of history where people, especially slaves and especially women slaves, were treated like property. And it's so hard for us to imagine that, because thankfully we're very far away from that in our culture and our time. But it wasn't the case.
It seems to me that they grew up with the concept of slavery. And this slavery with rules seems to be a transition. Instead of from full slavery to full freedom, there is a transition period where there were rules, you treat people well, and they can get out of it, but not immediately without a mental and physical transition.
Absolutely. And Joyce's point is actually exactly what the medieval commentators, Rashi and Maimonides, wrote about. They wrote about these laws being transitional laws to basically get people to a system where they would be free. What's amazing is that when Rashi and Rambam were writing this 800, 900 years ago, there were still a lot of people that were slaves. Not so much in Europe. There were slaves still in Europe, but in much of North Africa and much of the Arab world, slavery wasn't really forbidden until the 19th and 20th centuries. So slaves were still being traded in Arab markets into again, according to some sources, into the 70s and 80s, there were still slaves being sold in Saudi Arabia. So this is real. As Joy said, this was a reality. And these rules are really trying to get us maybe away from this type of behavior. That would be the hope, but it took a long time, and it took a lot of kind of world culture catching up and eventually taking these laws into effect. And behind it, I really do believe, is this understanding in Judaism that our experience as slaves has taught us this is not a way for people to live, and that our experience creates an empathy and creates an understanding that there needs to be rules and protection for slaves as well. So again, it definitely is a transition and making people kind of be a little bit more cognizant of human rights. Now we're going to get into some laws which maybe seem more serious. It definitely seem more serious, but they're all, in a sense, they're connected to this idea of how do we maintain law and order, and how do we govern ourselves as a society that isn't just directed by a king deciding this is the law and this is my law, but that these laws are universal, or at least practiced by the society as societal covenantal laws, which, keep in mind, was unique and, again, almost unheard of, that it wasn't being implemented by a dictator or by a king, somebody who just makes up these laws, that these are God's laws and that they're incumbent on everybody universally and across the board. So it doesn't matter whether you're a king or a prince or an elder or chief, these laws are for everybody. So let's keep that in mind as we're reading these. These are not one law for one person and one law for the other. He who fatally strikes a man shall be put to death. Okay. We already read in the Ten Commandments, this is murder. This is a little bit, again, maybe a corollary to it, or one that, again, isn't just murder. This is makeish. If he strikes a man and dies, then he's put to death. So this is a little different from murdering somebody, because you can murder somebody with full intent to murder them, killed them, and then, it's eye for an eye, essentially, right? This is an interesting one, because this is saying he may not have died. He may not have intended for the person to die, but he fatally struck the person. So he hit the person. He definitely hit the person, and the person died. He may not have intended to kill him, but again, you could call this manslaughter, but it was still brought on by the action directly. Could one make the argument that this would be the equivalent of killing someone in a car accident? Maybe, but it might be a little bit stronger than that, with the intention that more that you struck somebody with anger, with force, you stabbed them. You weren't necessarily trying to kill them, but you did kill them. You were trying to hurt them. And there was definitely a causation here with an act of hurting the person, because the word makeh means that they struck the person. Was it an intentional striking? Probably. It doesn't seem like it would have been an unintentional strike, but because look at the next line. If he did not do it by design, but it came by an act of God, I will assign you a place to which he can flee. So this seems to be, again, there are definitely gray areas, driving a car and driving drunk or impaired, or, looking at your phone while you hit and then hit the person. It definitely wasn't by design. But was it also an act of God? I don't know. That's a difficult, again, a gray area, but what they're saying is that person doesn't die if they're not killed. There's no capital punishment for them, assuming that, again, it was not done intentionally with an act of trying to kill them. He still killed them with an act of manslaughter, but a little different, right? When a man schemes against another and kills him treacherously, you shall take him from my very altar to be put to death. So even if the guy has held sanctuary in my altar, take him out of there, get him out and kill him. There's no place for that person to live. So there is no there is no place for that person to hide. There is no place to hide, even in my own altar. There is no sanctuary in my altar for someone who's committed, who's committed murder. He who strikes his father or mother shall be put to death. Seems again interesting because it doesn't say he kills them, right? That would be murder. But if he struck his parents, that's a death sentence. So this is not murder for murder. This is striking a parent, which is, of course, the fifth commandment combined with, some of the other principles that we're getting here. Pretty strict. Here's another commandment about thievery. Here's stealing a person, because it says he who kidnaps a man. And that's the same word that's used, gonev ish. That means to steal a man. So it's the lo tignov, ganef, that's the word. Gonev ish, somebody who kidnaps or steals a man, whether he has sold him or is still holding him, he shall be put to death. So if he has the person still, or if he's already sold him, doesn't matter.
But isn't that what happened to Joseph? He was sold by his brothers.
Now, you're absolutely right, which means that they knew, well, assuming that they knew the law, you could make the argument that they didn't know the law yet. But come on,
Yeah,
this is a pretty simple, straightforward kind of law that makes sense, that kidnapping is a capital offense, which it is in some societies. It's not in America, but it is in some societies. Kidnapping people can be a capital offense in societies that have these kinds of capital laws on the books. Kidnapping could have been. I mean, it makes sense in the sense that when you take away somebody's freedom, you take away their life and their
life. Yes.
So yes, Joseph had, and the rabbis point out, there was a legitimate answer for Joseph's brothers of they could have been executed.
They must have been very fearful,
very scared, which they are.
But was the law in effect at that time? Because Joseph happened well before this.
Correct. So there is that question whether it was incumbent on them. Some people would say yes, other people would say no, that Abraham and Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob taught these laws to their family even before. So the rabbis like this idea that the law was always there, that the Torah was there, and now it's just being released to everybody. Everybody's going to see it now. They kind of forgot it maybe in Egypt. They didn't know it after Joseph. As they were slaves, they didn't know the law. So the rabbis don't like this idea that there was a time when they didn't have to follow the law. Just remember that is kind of their operating. They don't like the idea that they don't like falling back on that line that Abraham didn't have to follow the law. Because part of the argument you could make with that is that if they didn't have the law, you could make the argument that they didn't have the law. But the idea that they weren't necessarily doing the right thing, but were still really, really righteous people, kind of begs the question, can't you be a really righteous person today and not follow the law? So they like this idea that they were both righteous people and, of course, they had the law. So they don't like to think that people are operating outside of the law, even if you can make the argument they didn't know it. So the rabbis like to hold that Abraham knew these rules, and God gave it to him, gave him in the knowledge of them instinctively. He learned them from Shem and Eber, his ancestors. Shem and Eber are the son and grandson of Noah, that this knowledge goes all the way back to the beginning because the Torah is there at the beginning. So there is this idea that these laws, are now being released, but to everyone. But again, so you very rarely will get that as an answer that they just didn't know it. But there definitely seems to be an understanding that these people and that the brothers, as Joyce says, are very scared. They clearly are once they see that Joseph is still alive and Joseph's the one they're standing in front of and has the power to kill them in that instant for no reason, any reason. He's the king of Egypt and he already accuses them of being spies. He could have killed them anytime. But here's the thing. He says to them, look, this was God's plan. Everything came about that's come about through this, which he felt at the time was really, really good because he's the second most powerful person in the world. He says, look, this was meant for good, that God's plan was what it all came out good. But yeah, this is a serious issue. And it is one where it's equated with killing somebody. So the next law is even stricter in some extent, which is who insults his father or mother shall be put to death. That's not even striking them. That's insulting them. Is it insulting them to their face? Is it insulting them publicly? Doesn't say. It just simply says insults. So it's a pretty strict law, and it's pretty strict. I mean, it's pretty strong, and it's fairly scary when again you consider that there's a very high standard there for the way you interact with your parents. Very strict. When men quarrel and one strikes the other with a stone or fist and he does not die but has to take to his bed, if he then gets up and walks outdoors upon his staff, the assailant shall go unpunished, except that he must pay for his idleness and his cure. So if you hurt somebody and the person doesn't die but is injured, you have to pay for the time that the person recovered, the recover time, and for his cure. I don't like the word idleness. It's the word shivto, which is from the word Shabbat. I would translate that as recovery, as rest. Shabbat means rest. So I don't know, it's idleness, but it's not like he's just being idle. He's recovering. He's getting healthy. And so you'd have to pay for his recovery time. You'd have to pay for the wages lost and for the money lost that he had. Okay, so that makes sense. You don't just pay for his cure, his hospital bills, if you will, but you also have to pay for the time that he's out from his work. So that's an interesting law of damages, if you will. Makes sense. When a man strikes his slave, male or female, with a rod and he dies, there and then he must be avenged. But if he survives a day or two, he is not to be avenged, since he is the other's property. So that's weird, because it basically says if you kill the guy right away, you're responsible for murder. You could be killed for killing a slave. That's what it's saying. If you kill a slave, you can be killed, and you have a right to be killed. But it says if the person doesn't die right away, then you're not liable for it. Now that seems kind of crazy, because you could have killed the guy, just died a few days later. It's kind of strange, because you'd say, well, how long does a person, if they die a week later after being beaten up by their master, that seems still pretty tough. But there is this kind of opening here, which basically says, the guy's definitely able to beat his slave, and we're not going to open this up to, we don't want it to be a gray area that extends too far. And so it kind of has this fallback position of saying, yeah, he can't kill the guy outright. He can't beat the guy that hard, but it's pretty tough to take that into consideration, that somebody could be beaten within an inch or two of their lives, and that was essentially okay. But again, you can see the logic behind it, which is a slave is your property, but that doesn't mean you can kill the person and play games with them, or, have them beaten and killed just for fun. That there's going to be consequences for you. And it doesn't say that you don't get punished. It just means that you don't get killed. You're not avenged as a murderer, which is a distinction that, one can make the argument there are still punitive things that would maybe go into effect for someone who beat a slave who later on died from those injuries. But just kind of keep in mind that avenging means you get to be killed for taking someone's life. Now, this law right now in verse 22 is arguably the most famous law in this whole parsha, definitely in this chapter, and maybe again in this whole parsha, maybe after the 10 commandments that we just read, this one might be the most quoted law in all of Exodus, interestingly enough. So let's read it. When men fight and one of them pushes a pregnant woman and a miscarriage results, but no other damage ensues, the one responsible shall be fined according as the woman's husband may exact from him, the payment to be based on reckoning. But if other damage ensues, the penalty shall be life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. This is the first time we get the ayin tachat ayin, eye for an eye. It's the law of lex talionis, as they say, the law of measure for measure. Again, did they take it literally? Probably never. Not that someone's eye had to be put out if they blinded somebody, but that they had to pay for the damages for an eye, and there was a damage, an assessed rate for that. That's not the first point. Is the point that everybody focuses on. When men fight and one of them pushes a pregnant woman, why is this law so important? Somebody tell me, why is this law so important? Anybody? Anybody want to throw down why this is so important?
Well, life is precious. And
Well, life is definitely precious, but we've heard that before. What have we just heard here that what do people get from this? Anybody?
It's the perpetuation of the community, children. So if you stop children from being born, you are more guilty.
Yeah, well, but we get that at other places too. There's one thing we get here that people really, really focus on, folks.
I missed it.
So here's my professor, Richard Friedman, who wrote a book called The Bible Now: Homosexuality, Abortion, Women, Death Penalty, and Earth. What the Bible says about these things, what the Bible actually says about these things. Because as he writes in this book, and he has a co-writer, Shauna Delansky, who's professor of religious studies at Northeastern University. This book is attempting again to recover what the Bible really tells us about these things. It's about the abortion one, because people sometimes, I'm going to read from his book, people sometimes derive law about abortion from the biblical law in which people, in the course of a fight, strike a pregnant woman and she has a miscarriage. And the text we just read, Exodus 21, 22 to 25. Here's what he says: caution! The meaning of this law is unclear in several different ways, and learned scholars have questioned and debated its meaning over 2 millennia. 2 men, or is it more than 2? And are they necessarily men? Are fighting and they cause a miscarriage? Or is it a premature labor? And it is one or both or all who cause it. By somehow striking the woman, and this results in injury or death to the woman, or is it to the baby? The law may mean the woman loses the child, and the question is then whether there is any injury to the mother or not. Or it may mean that the child is born alive, and the question is then whether there is any injury to the child or not. Here's the problem, folks. This is one of the few texts that we have in the whole Bible that deals with anything coming near abortion. And so what he says is this portion is not about abortion. It is about accidental miscarriage. It is about the unintended consequences of a fight involving miscarriage rather than abortion, and being about unintended consequences rather than about a procedure whose consequences are planned. This law is an extremely difficult precedent on which to base any view either for abortion or against it. The goal at best, therefore, is not to get a direct ruling on abortion from it. Rather, people on both sides of abortion debates seek to find some basic principle in the case that might then apply to the question of abortion. That is a good approach, but the passage is just too uncertain even for that. It simply cannot be the basis for a definitive answer to such an important issue. The problem is that this is really all people have. It does not really talk about abortion in the Bible at all. And there's a passage from Jeremiah that he talks about, which has to do with Jeremiah saying he wishes that he was aborted, essentially. And so that is more of maybe, tells us a little bit more about it than this passage. But unfortunately, people derive the law or their views on abortion or what the Bible says about abortion from it. Though, again, Friedman says, don't do that. But people do. And so here's the logic behind it. The logic behind it is that, and why people do that, the logic behind people deriving the law here is because when the miscarriage happens, the person is fined and they're not punished by death. So if the woman simply miscarries, then there's a fine. Again, he says don't derive anything too much from that, but there are a lot of people who do. And it is the proof text for Judaism. When people say Judaism allows for abortion, they'll turn to this text and they'll say, this is the text that says that. So it's a really important passage from the standpoint of people trying to find biblical answers for things or justifications for things. And it's problematic at best because it really doesn't deal with that. But again, everybody knows it does. And so he had to say that. He had to deal with it because, again, this is what everyone turns to. They've turned to Exodus 21:22 for many years to derive the law from it and to say that Judaism is more permissive about abortion than Catholicism or any other religion or any other form of any religion or denomination. That's not here, but people will look at it for that. And I'm just telling you, Friedman, he's not liberal or conservative. He doesn't really talk about politics from the standpoint of like what his own personal ideas are. He just says, don't derive laws from this because it's problematic. And it's not really about that. It's not really about abortion. The fact that the Bible doesn't deal with abortion as a penalty, as a specified crime, that in itself might be a little bit more indicative of what Judaism says about it, because it's not specifically prohibited. But you can't say that there's a law derived from it not being mentioned, because again, that also doesn't. Not every law is in the Torah. Not every rule is spelled out. But one can make the argument it's not prohibited with a penalty of death specifically. So that being said, I will tell you that this is oftentimes the only law that people talk about from this Torah portion. They get so wrapped up into this law or this rule that they don't see anything besides the context of the rest of the portion, what else is in this portion, or really what this whole portion is about, which is about law protecting life and the fact that accidents happen and that there has to be accommodation for acts of God, of accidents, of things that aren't supposed to happen but do anyways. And sometimes they're very serious, and sometimes they do lead to death, and sometimes they do lead to permanent injuries and very serious things. But I will tell you, I don't want to make people I'm not saying what the politics of these things are. What I'm telling you is the Torah is pretty protective of human life and recognizes that if a life is taken, there has to be consequences for it, even if it's accidental, even if it's in this case in utero. And that there are consequences for our actions, and that we just can't walk away and say, it was a fetus, doesn't really matter. That's really what the Torah is saying here, is it does matter, and that there should be a penalty. And what's so interesting is that people get that. The problem is that abortion's become such a hyper politicized issue that people sometimes forget that, like, most people would agree that if you injured a pregnant woman and she was 7 months, 8 months pregnant and then had a miscarriage and the baby died, people would say, on all sides would say, oh, that person should be held accountable. That's what the Torah is saying here, is that that person should be held accountable. Especially if there's a fight. Now, it doesn't just say the person, slipped on their front porch, which is also a tragedy and one that probably would be litigated today. But there's something else that happened here, which is that there was a fight and that a woman was hurt during the fight. So that's also there as well, which is that there's something happening here that shouldn't be happening. So I guess you can keep that in mind as well. But it does say that there's a serious attitude we take with life and a potential life. That's the only thing we can say for certain, is that there's a potentiality of life, which there is a reckoning for. So that is the law of the fighting, which, again, there's a lot more questions to that too. Now we go back to slaves. When a man strikes the eye of his slave, male or female, and destroys it, he shall let him go free on account of his eye. If he knocks out the tooth of his slave, male or female, he shall let him go free on account of his tooth. Folks, if you thought that the law about not being a slave was strict, because if you kill him, you could die, here's even more so. Man, if you hurt your slave, he goes free. So hitting a slave hard, probably not a good idea if you want to continue to derive benefit from the slave. So again, there's a protection here in it, which is not death or murder. The consequences are not, life or death, but it is protection. Let's talk about the ox that gores. This is a shore, the goring ox. When an ox gores a man or a woman to death, that ox shall be stoned, and its flesh shall not be eaten. But the owner of the ox is not to be punished. So this is if you have an animal that's in your possession, you don't die if that ox kills them, because again, you didn't kill him, you own the ox. You can make the argument it's a dangerous animal and it was an accident, and it's a horrific thing, but it's not your fault. However, if that ox has been in the habit of goring and its owner, though warned, has failed to guard it and it kills a man or woman, the ox shall be stoned and the owner too shall be put to death. So there is a caveat here, which is a really important one because it is a life or death caveat. You cannot have an ox that is a goring ox, a known ox that does this kind of thing. So if there's a warning and the animal continues to do this over and over again and then kill somebody, you are liable, because essentially you've now taken on this responsibility and you haven't mitigated it. You haven't removed that danger. And now you're responsible for death that ensued from that. So it's a law that protects people in some cases, but they have responsibilities too. So the law protects people, which is good, protects an owner or a property owner or a owner of in this case, an animal. But if you, and again, this could be, any kind of transportation and, but essentially, if you killed somebody through your knowing, now again, you're knowing the knowing danger that you're putting into the world, you're responsible for it. So this is a law that, again, has a corollary to it, which is very serious. If ransom is laid upon him, he must pay whatever is laid upon him to redeem his life. So too, if it gores a minor, male or female, the owner shall be dealt with according to the same rule. If the ox gores a slave, male or female, he shall pay 30 shekels of silver to the master, and the ox shall be stoned. So the corollary, and again, the laws for what happens with this goring ox, you can see that there are intermediary steps depending on who that ox kills. Kind of strange that, again, could be death, but it could be a monetary fee as well.
It's a lesson for now too, because many years ago, we had an Akita. An Akita is a guard dog.
Yeah.
And while we're on vacation, the guard dog attacked a neighbor who thought that my housekeeper was in danger. So the dog was protecting the housekeeper and very badly scratched and damaged one arm. So the insurance paid for the arm. So we did that. However, I was still responsible, and I arranged for the Akita to be adopted by somebody who had 5 acres, blocked in, alone, wanted an Akita, and was willing to take care of him, and there were no people coming and going.
It's nice.
So that you have to be responsible, even if you don't have an ox. If you have a dangerous dog, you have to do something about it.
And I think you're absolutely right. And the principle really does kind of, and you said it, which is, if you have a dog that is a guard dog, is a dog that is known to, again, you could say certain breeds of dogs are more protective, and they're more aggressive. If you have an animal and I mean, look, anyone who knows that they have one of these dogs knows that they have a dog. I mean, the little dog that I got, the Golden Doodle, is not that kind of dog. So again, the assumption that the dog's going to hurt somebody is not really there. But again, if you have a dog that is going to be protective, and that there's some responsibility there. But it's nice if again the dog is not doing anything wrong, that is essentially doing what it does.
For 6-7 years, it did nothing wrong, but then when we were away, it did, and we had to do something about it because we were responsible.
Yeah, but on the other hand, too, it's good that the dog didn't have to be destroyed, because it really didn't do anything outside of what it should have done.
Right.
And again, this is an example of nobody really doing anything wrong. And that really kind of falls into that first category of an ox that doesn't normally do anything like that. Again, if you had kept that dog and then it did it again, you can make the argument that now you've been warned, right, and now you know that it's going to fall into this other category of, there's a warning now, that the dog can do this, and then you have another level of responsibility. But again, I think there's this understanding that, look, there are rules, and then we sometimes have to have corollaries to that rule, so that we take into consideration possibilities, and then sometimes we have to have corollaries to corollaries. I will tell you that the Talmud, the section of the Talmud that deals with the goring ox, which goes through primarily tractate through the Nezikin, which is called damages. That tractate in the Talmud is I think it's the second longest, or one of the longest sections of the Talmud, deals with damages. It is a huge, huge section of the Talmud. It is pages and pages and pages of corollaries to corollaries to corollaries on these things, like the goring ox, and the next one that we're going to look at now. So there's the shore, which is the ox, the shore, and then there's the boar. They rhyme. it doesn't sound like that in English, but the ox and the pit, the shore ubor, the shore and bore, the ox and the well or the pit. Because here it deals with a pit or a well. When a man opens a pit or digs a pit and does not cover it, and an ox or an ass falls into it, the one responsible for the pit must make restitution. He shall pay the price to the owner, but shall keep the dead animal. So he gets to keep a dead animal, which is not a whole lot of help because you can't really eat it. It's treif. It's something that died in a way that wasn't kosher. So there's not a whole lot you can do with it. You can feed it to another animal. You can maybe sell it to somebody who, the Gentile, down the street who doesn't keep kosher. But it's could be a huge restitution because an ox was very expensive. That's why destroying an ox was a huge monetary responsibility for somebody. It's not like, oh, we just went out and killed an ox. This is a person's livelihood. I mean, literally, to some extent, you saw how much a person has to pay for a slave that dies, which is 30 shekels. That's like the value of a slave. The ox could be that much as well for an ox because the ox was so valuable as transportation, as work, as again, something that people used for breeding, for cows, for milk. This is a huge investment. And so making restitution would have been a huge problem for somebody. And so here is a law that you are responsible for, the work that you do, which could, again, cause damage to your neighbors. And so you are responsible for doing these things like digging a pit, digging a well. So again, the assumption here is that people dug this hole probably, again, for water, maybe for, some purposes of how you're running your own farm. But if you do it in a public area or an area that, again, other people have an opportunity to use or have an area where it's not necessarily on your property or in a common area or near, again, you were responsible for it. When a man injures his neighbor's ox and it dies, they shall sell the live ox and divide its price. They shall also divide the dead animal. Interesting. So this is not killing it immediately, but again, being responsible for it. If, however, it is known that the ox was in the habit of goring and its owner has failed to guard it, he must restore ox for ox, but shall keep the dead animal. So that is an example, again, of oxes that are attacking each other's. And again, you have to pay restitution. And again, the person responsible for it is, if the ox was a known goring ox, clearly that person is responsible. It wasn't just, the ox has had a fight. Your ox is known to be aggressive and you killed this other ox. So you're responsible for it. And you get a dead ox. That's all you get. The other guy gets the live ox. When a man steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it, he shall pay 5 oxen for the ox and 4 sheep for the sheep. So this is punitive damages for theft, which are huge. I mean, this is a huge payment, punishment for, again, for theft. So this is clearly theft. This isn't like, the person had an ox just wandered onto their property. This is for as we would say down in Texas, for cattle rustling, which cattle rustling could be killed. It's capital offense back in the day. Cattle rustlers can hang them. So I'm not encouraging that kind of behavior today, but people understood that if you take someone's ox or sheep, you're taking away their livelihood, and they could essentially, lose their property, lose their independence because of your stuff. So if you're engaging in theft, you're gonna pay. So you don't pay with your life, but you do pay a tremendous penalty. The punitive damages on theft definitely would encourage people not to go into that line of work. Don't become a thief, because if you do it in the Jewish community, you're going to be paying several times over. So there's no issue there with it. um, it's a huge, again, for the ox, it's even higher because it's 5 times, it's 4 times for sheep. So here's a couple interesting laws about theft. If a thief is seized while tunneling and is beaten to death, there is no blood guilt in his case. If the sun is risen on him, there is blood guilt on the case. He must make restitution. If he lacks the means, he shall be sold for his theft. It's very strange here. It basically is basically dealing with, again, thievery here, and what happens when you catch somebody in the act of stealing. So
Is that what tunneling is? Tunneling is stealing?
yeah, it's getting it's getting into
Sneaking into the
sneaking
house?
into the house. It's, you know, it's coming under their fence or coming into their house through a, you know, surreptitious way, and you catch the guy in the act. There's no guilt if you kill him. So it's an interesting law. It's not one that, again, you know, it's so strange that someone would be caught while they're in the act. But there's this kind of understanding I would say, you know, like what's really going on here. And again, you know, the assumption, of course, could be that they're just there to steal. But, you know, there's a weird idea here, I think, that comes with theft, which is, you know, the assumption is, okay, the person's just going to steal. But what if the person found people in the house? And, you know, what if, you know, what would the guy do if, you know, what would he do if the people were there, and would he kill the people who are at home if he got in there? So
I don't know.
so there's this kind of idea that you know, we don't know the intent of somebody when they're breaking into your house. You are allowed to kill somebody in the act of it if you catch them and you don't kill them right away, then you are liable for murder. There almost is this understanding here, I would say, to some extent, that if somebody's, you can make the argument that the law here is really trying to prevent anybody from going into the business of breaking into a person's house, because it's basically saying to the person who the would-be thief is, if you get beaten to death while you're breaking into someone's house, that's on you. There's not going to be any punishment for the person who does that. So don't do it, because you're all bets are off if you do that. Your life is now, it's up for grabs. Doesn't have to kill you, but if he does, he's not responsible for it. It's not like you forfeited your protection under the law, if you will. So it really is kind of a cautionary tale, you know, for people to not want to for doing that. Now, what does the second part really mean? You know, kind of, I think there's an understanding that if the sun rises on this situation and the guy is coming in there, and this is being a long drawn out siege, if you will, you can't go and kill the guy anymore, because the guy was either caught in the act and, he's now responsible for breaking into your house, but he's not going to kill you anymore. The idea that he's been caught, you caught him, and everybody sees what's happening, and it's the bright, it's out in the middle of the day. Now there's no darkness. Now this is now not anymore. You're protecting your home.
It's not a nighttime home invasion where you're terrified in the middle of the night somebody broke in.
Yeah. And so there's this kind of understanding that, look, there's limits to protecting your house, if you will, which I think is fair. I mean, I think if you caught an intruder, you have enough, I guess the equivalent today would be if you catch an intruder in the act and you don't have to kill him and you've captured him, you've got a gun on him, whatever, you call the police come. If you have the gun on him and the guy's just sitting there and you're waiting for the police and then you shoot him, you can make the argument that now you've gone a little too far. You've taken the law into your own hands and you're not protecting yourself anymore. You just executed the guy. And that's a little, now that's not, you can't make the argument that you are protecting your life anymore. So let's just say you bound the guy. Let's say you have the guy in handcuffs and then you shoot him. No, that's not, you've gone too far. So this is kind of, there are limits to protecting your house. Yeah, you can do it, but there are limits. So what if he stole, whether an ox or sheep, and is found alive in his possession, he shall pay double. So this is weird because, again, he didn't kill it. He didn't sell it. He has it. Then he has to pay double. So this is a case where restitution can be made, and it is made, and it's punitive, but it's not as punitive as if, he's killed it. He doesn't have it anymore. He sold it to somebody else. Again, the laws are definitely there to protect society and also to caution people not to go into the business of thieving. Don't do this, because the punishments are stiff. And again, the idea is that people know that the punishments are stiff, that they won't do it. To know that the laws are going to protect the society and not the criminals are really important. Yeah, criminals are still people, but they essentially forfeit their protection if they're going to engage in crime. And we've gone in weird ways now on this in our own country, where in some cases criminals end up getting protection, which is insane.
Yes.
But and there are no limits to what lawyers will sometimes justify when they defend criminals, in some cases who've been injured while they've been committing crimes and have sued the people who, have been trying to protect their homes. So we have that craziness now. We've gone completely onto the other side, which is weird because it kind of is logical that you protect the innocent civilian. You protect the homeowner, you protect the people who are the victims, and really importantly, to scare people away from doing crimes. If people think that there's not going to be a penalty for what they do, they may do it. Let people be scared of the consequences. I would say makes sense. Human behavior kind of dictates that people tend to respond to the fear of being caught and being, really stiff sentences. They're there to protect people. They're not just because people want people they get perverse pleasure out of having people be punished. That doesn't happen in Judaism. And there are limits to how people can be punished. But again, people should be scared of the punishment that's coming to them. It should encourage them not to do it. And again, to be protective of an innocent person and just a normal person. Another example, again, when a man lets his livestock loose to graze in another's land and so allows a field or vineyard to be grazed bare, he must make restitution for the impairment of that field or vineyard. So, we protect people's property. Makes sense. Should be a common sense law. Unfortunately, not so common sense anymore. When a fire is started and spreads to thorns so that stacked, standing, or growing grain is consumed, he who started the fire must make restitution. Okay, also makes sense. You're responsible for damages that that you started. Your responsibility extends to, again, people's property, and you know, you may not have intended, but you have to make restitution. Here's a weird set of laws about what happens when you're in possession of things that are not yours. When a man gives money or goods to another for safekeeping, and they are stolen from the man's house, if the thief is caught, he shall pay double. If the thief is not caught, the owner of the house shall depose before God that he has not laid hands on the other's property. In all charges of misappropriation pertaining to an ox, an ass, or a sheep, or garment, or any other loss whereof one party alleges this is it, the case of both parties shall come before God. He whom God declares guilty shall pay double to the other. So these laws that have to do with property also have a lot to do with, again, who has property, who's responsible for the property, whether the property was leased out or given as safekeeping, whether the property was given as collateral, as surety against a loan. All of these things are at play in the Talmud, and the Talmud has pages and pages and pages about this issue of holding property for somebody else. And the Torah has these categories that again, the Talmud then has categories on those categories. So there is this idea that, again, you are responsible for someone's property when it comes into your house. However, if it's stolen from that house, you're clearly not responsible for it. The damage really isn't on you. Shouldn't be on you, because the logic is that if a thief went into his house and took it from his house, you wouldn't be responsible for it. So you have to take precautions. You have to be responsible, take responsibility for the person's property. So, for example, the Talmud says, if you have someone's property and you've taken it on their responsibility, if you've told the person, yes, I'll take care of your property for you, or I'll hold it as collateral. If you don't guard it properly, then you're responsible for it. So there's this idea that if you don't have it protected in a good way, for example, if you're holding someone's goats or sheep and you don't have those goats or sheep protected from animals, from being able to walk off, and then you are responsible for it. There are responsibilities that you have for someone's property when it's in your control, and if you don't take the necessary precautions for it. So, the example here kind of from the modern era is if somebody gives you something for safekeeping, and the understanding is that you're going to keep it in your house. But let's say you take it out in your car. So somebody gives you a phone or whatever, some electronics, and it's something that you can carry with you. If he or she gave it to you and for safekeeping, and you put it in your car and you're driving around with it, and then somebody breaks in your car and takes it, well, look, you're partly responsible for that because you took it out of a area of safekeeping. Okay, it doesn't say that in the Torah, but the Torah does say, we have to kind of go to God for this, which again is to go to the courts, because wherever it says you go to God for something, you go to God for this. You go to Ha Elohim, to God. The rabbis oftentimes in the Talmud will say, whenever you see this kind of phrase, you go to God, you go to court, because God enforces laws through the courts. So where is God present? God is present in the court. And in a court that is administering law through God. So Ha Elohim here, the word Elohim, which is clearly God, the rabbis will say, when you see that in certain places, especially in situations of law, this applies to this is actually talking about judges and courts. So court would decide and say, look, you were no longer again, what we in Hebrew in the Talmudic language would be a guard who is a responsible guardian. You become an irresponsible guardian, and now you've taken on some liability. So And all charges of misappropriation, again, yeah. This is a this is somebody saying, look, if you're responsible for misappropriating something, that's not just I'm looking after it. You essentially embezzled it, you stole it, you maybe did it under the cover of I'm taking care of it. The example to this, I think modern examples would be when you give somebody an investment, and you misappropriate it, knowing that you're going to do something wrong with it. This is a case of not simply losing something where you'd have to pay equal restitution for it. This is you've now essentially stolen it, and now you have to pay like you would in other crimes of theft. You now have to pay a penalty. You now have to pay a punitive damage for it. Very serious, again, trying to dissuade people from committing crimes, not just to do restitution, but punitive penalties as well. When a man gives to another an ass or a sheep or any other animal to guard it, and it dies or is injured or is carried off with no witnesses about, an oath before the Lord shall decide between the two of them that the one has not laid hands on the property of the other. The owner must acquiesce, and no restitution shall be made. So again, we're talking about a situation here where we can't prove that the person was responsible for being a bad guardian, if you will. They're not a bad guardian. So again, this is a law of, kind of, again, we when it says the Lord shall decide, again, we would say that they go to, that this is, we have to turn this over to a higher authority, if you will. But if the animal was stolen from him, he shall make restitution to its owner. If it was torn by beasts, he shall bring it as evidence. He did not need to replace what was torn by beasts. So that's not, he's not responsible for that. When a man borrows an animal from another and it dies or is injured, its owner not being with it, he must make restitution. So again, this is a owner or a holder that is not being responsible guardian. If its owner was with it, no restitution need be made. But if it was hired, he is entitled to the hire. So again, this has to do with, again, animals that you would lease out to another third party. So, you had a pack animal or you had an ox using it for farm, essentially like a tractor. If you took it out and lent it to if somebody lent it to you or gave it for you to safekeeping, and then it gets lent out, that person's, that person who owns it, the original owner, is entitled to the money that animal brings you. The Talmud gets into very interesting discussions about these kinds of things because, again, in some cases, these animals could be could have other animals, right? And so who's entitled to those animals that the procreation, the natural procreation that goes on if that animal is brought to you and it then, has babies? Is the original owner entitled to those? So there's interesting discussions about that. Again, if there's breeding that happens intentionally or unintentionally. All right. Again, the Talmud goes on for pages about this stuff. It's very important. Now, let's take a look at another set of laws that have to do with what we would call family law. Now, again, I use that term in the way the rabbis do, which is this is about the definition of families in those days, which included, in some cases, this category of slaves, obviously, but also different categories of how people were, if you will, brought into the family. Let's take a look. If a man seduces a virgin for whom the bride price has not been paid and lies with her, he must make her his wife by payment of a bride price. If her father refuses to give her to him, he must still weigh out silver in accordance with the bride price for virgins. Now, again, this seems to be kind of strange, because are they telling somebody that he has to pay for? Now, one could again make the argument what we're talking about here is not rape. It does not say that he forced himself on the woman, but he is clearly taking advantage of the woman and has essentially slept with her, and she no longer would be considered a bride of a virgin bride, and a bride that would be able to be command, if you will, a price for a young woman. And so essentially the man responsible for this, right? It's very strange, because what we have is a protection for women, which on the face of it doesn't seem like protection. It seems maybe kind of crass and what a horrific thing. But it really does protect a woman and dissuades a man from sleeping with a woman who's not his wife, or that he hasn't agreed to bring in as his wife, because essentially if he sleeps with her, he has to pay her what he would have to pay for a bride, and he may not be able to marry her. So it's up to the father. And if the father said, hey, I don't want you to marry my daughter, then you just wound up essentially paying for a woman, for the value of a woman who no longer is not going to be your woman. So again, to think about the context, the societal context that we're talking about here, gosh, I mean, forget today. You can never enforce a law or a rule like that today, but understand that, again, this really would dissuade people from sleeping with women that were, or taking advantage of women that were, he just thought he could take advantage of. It really does. It does, basically say, you mess around like that, it could cost you. You can make the argument that if a man was rich enough, he wouldn't care. But most people wouldn't like this to happen. They wouldn't want to have to pay a bride price for a woman that they weren't able to marry. Most people couldn't afford that and wouldn't want to do that. So really would dissuade somebody from doing that. So probably didn't happen that much. Now we get into some laws that we see very similar rules in the book of Deuteronomy. And again, seem to be based on this idea of not behaving like the Gentiles around you, the pagans around you. Not tolerate. You shall not tolerate a sorceress. Okay. Whoever lies with a beast shall be put to death. Whoever sacrifices to a god other than the Lord shall be proscribed. And again, the word haram is either, being killed or being exiled, excommunicated. These are kind of like put in a little different way than the 10 Commandments are. But these are interesting laws of, some fairly serious commandments that, what binds them together is this idea that you don't behave like the pagans around you. Now we get this wonderful first time, but we get it many times, dozens of times, literally dozens of times. I don't mean 12 times. I mean like 36 times. We get this phrase in the Torah. You shall not wrong a stranger or oppress him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. That line and versions of that line are so important in the Torah. And one could make the argument, as Friedman does in the other book that I said was a really great one, the Exodus. He makes the statement that because of the experience of slavery, the experience of Egypt leads us to be empathetic to other people, and that the experience of living in Egypt teaches us to care for others, and not just our own people, but people who live in our midst who aren't Jewish. And this is radically a departure from almost every other law that we've ever seen, definitely in the ancient world, but really even up until the modern era, where strangers or people who were not citizens were not protected or not afforded protection under the law. United States arguably, again, does more for protecting immigrants and people who are not from this country than any other country in the world. Lots of laws to protect people. But the Torah is the first example of that we have in human history, where we have a literal covenant that protects the stranger in our midst. And this is an amazing concept. And it's one that, again, the Torah derives from the experience of slavery. So why is the Exodus, not just an experience of freedom for ourselves, but freedom for everybody? Because the Torah repeats it over and over again, literally dozens of times. You'll see it again, even in this portion. This phrase, we don't tolerate people that are going to use as a defense. Yeah, but they weren't citizens. We can treat them like garbage because they're strangers. They're not protected. There's no law for them, not according to Judaism. And there was an understanding that these are vulnerable people. These are people that can be taken advantage of because they don't have family, assumedly. They don't have a community that can protect them. And so we have to protect them as they're our own people, because again, we lived in that kind of vulnerable situation, which again, then we have these phrases, you shall not ill-treat any widow or orphan. Later on in Deuteronomy, we include the Levite in that Levite seems to be included in the protection. Now I'm laughing a little bit because another thing that I mentioned is a part of Friedman's understanding of this is the reason that it doesn't say Levites here is because he believes that the Levites are the only people that were necessarily part of the Exodus. And so it doesn't have to say Levites here because they're all Levites. I'm only saying that's what his argument is that when it doesn't talk about Levites, which it doesn't in Deuteronomy, it does in Deuteronomy, doesn't do it here. It's because these are all Levites. These are the Levite tribe that came out of Egypt. And then the Levites are, spoken about in the third person later on in Deuteronomy, because now they're part of the community and of the rest of Israel, and they need to be protected too. The widow, the orphan, the Levite, are all part of that group. They're not mentioned here. If you do mistreat them, I will heed their cry as soon as they cry out to me. And my anger shall blaze forth, and I will put you to the sword, and your own wives shall become widows and children orphans. So God says, I will vindicate, I will protect those people. That's a pretty strict law, which is that God is going to protect the stranger, just as God protected us in Egypt. God's going to protect the strangers in our midst, and of course, also those vulnerable people, the widow, the orphan. So again, if you mistreat a widow or orphan, your wives will become widows and orphans, and your children orphans. Your children will, you'll be dead. So it's pretty strict. It's pretty strong language there. Here we go. This law, lots of people talk about this law, and definitely is an unusual law for its day. If you lend money to my people, to the poor among you, do not act toward them as a creditor. Exact no interest from them. This is the law of usury, that you're not allowed to exact interest. You're not allowed to charge interest to your people. Let's talk about that, and then we'll get into the corollary to this. So you lend money to somebody who's a Jew. You can't charge them interest. So number one, why will you lend to people if you can't charge interest? Probably won't, which is why eventually Jewish law allows for people to charge interest to other people. But there definitely is this idea that God doesn't want us to be making money off of each other for helping each other, which is probably, again, makes sense when you're in a tribal society where people can help each other, and you understand that it's not a commercial society where people are literally making money on trade or on commerce. We're really talking here about people who are buying goats and who are farming and who are trying to live in a basic subsistence farming and agricultural society. Doesn't work when you're doing commerce and trading, obviously. But this law is part of Jewish law. And as people become not necessarily Jewish, but as they start to follow the Torah, Christians take this law on as a biblical injunction. Can't charge interest. Why? Because the Bible says you can't charge interest. So what they do is they bring in a class of people to charge interest, who ironically are Jews, us. Bringing Jews in to loan money is a really convenient way to get around this law, because it says my people. I can loan money to you if I'm not you. And so Jews are allowed to be money changers and lenders, which works really well until the debts get too high. And then it becomes, let's get rid of our debt by throwing out the Jews. So Jews had a very precarious position, because on one hand, there was money to be made in earning and knowing how to lend money. But there's a precarious position to be in, because if you become too successful and if people owe too much money to you, then they just decide, you know what, let's just kill you. And now we don't owe anybody any money. So you really had to navigate this situation. Now, eventually, of course, the church lost the power over people. They lost the power to enforce this. And so the English and the Italians figured out in the Renaissance period, no, we don't have to do this. And so they started charging interest, and they didn't need Jews anymore to lend money to them. And that ironically was kind of the beginning of the end for that being a business for Jews. However, there were some Jews by that period, especially people like the Rothschilds and the Warburgs and other families across Europe, that were able to become successful enough to have multinational corporations and to have banking businesses that ended up being very successful, because by that point, they became powerful enough to lend money and to have credit on a global level. And so eventually, when the British started creating banks, those banks, those institutions were already very strong and were not necessarily competitive, but they were in very much entrenched on a global level. And so that did allow Jews to continue to engage in commerce. The Rothschilds and the Warburgs are some of the more famous families, but there were other families that also were able to engage in commerce, including in this country as well. And part of it was not just that the law allowed for it, Jewish law allowed for us to loan to Gentiles, but also, if you think about it, because there were Jewish communities around the world and networks of people that were minority communities that dealt with each other, the Jewish communities were able to do business on a global level because there were connections through the community. And Rothschilds in particular sent members of their family to every one of the European capitals so that the family was able to control this as a family, which you can make the argument anybody could have done it, but they did it, and other people didn't do it. And more importantly, because the community expected there to be ethical behavior amongst the community, the expectations and the protections were there, so that people knew that if they did business with a Jewish bank or Jews did business with each other, that they knew that the reputation was important enough and valuable enough that there was going to be ethical transactions, and transactions that needed nothing else than a contract or an agreement that the business would be able to be conducted, and they trusted it. There was nothing more that needed to be done. And the Torah actually says that in a situation where we have a contract or we have a loan that's going to be done, it says right here, if you take your neighbor's garment in pledge, you must return it to him before the sun sets. It is his only clothing, the sole covering for his skin. And what else shall he sleep? Therefore, if he cries out to me, I will pay heed, for I am compassionate. So if you take something as a pledge, understand it better not be the only thing the person gets to sleep in. And so it really dissuades people from even holding something as collateral, especially something that the person needs for their livelihood or for their protection or for, again, basic standards of living. People don't have to give up their basic standards of living as collateral. So again, there's an understanding that, yeah, you can do business, but there are limits to how we do business with people. We must treat people ethically and with compassion because God's going to demand it. So real important stuff, because again, it put into play Jewish business practices that exist even arguably till today. Because again, we take very seriously this, it's within the family or it's within the community. And we understand that when somebody in the Jewish community commits a crime or is involved with shady dealings, that it brings down the whole community. And we understand that. We know that. We believe it. We've seen it. And the most obvious example of it, the Madoff scandal, we have to remember that most of the damage that happened in the Madoff scandal was internally within the Jewish community. Most of the people that lost money in that horrific crime were other Jews. So again, we understand what we're talking about when we talk about the consequences for this. So, you shall not revile God, nor put a curse upon a chieftain among your people. You shall not put off the skimming of your first yield of your vats. You shall give me the firstborn among your sons. You shall do the same with your cattle and your flocks. 7 days it shall remain with its mother. On the 8th day you shall give it to me. And what we're talking about here, of course, the first is about, again, treating people in your community, especially people of authority, with respect. But also, again, that things that are, again, your success comes from God. And that is a really important lesson here too, that people will people must have a way of dedicating their first things, including their firstborn animals and even their children, right? Which is the law of Pidyon Haben, which we already read about. That first child has to be redeemed. Your first son has to be redeemed back. And it says, you shall be a holy people to me. You must not eat flesh torn by beasts in the field. You shall cast it to the dogs. And as we read yesterday, and back to the dogs, to the Akitas, if you will, we have to protect our animals, and we don't eat treif. We don't eat animals that have been torn apart. Treifa, that's where the word treif comes from. Not kosher. It's not pig. It's not unkosher animals. It's meat that's been torn by beasts or torn, that you find in the field. It's animals that have died by being torn apart. We'd also then later on say that they've died, natural causes. You can't eat them, but the dogs get them. So yay, if you're a dog, you get to eat all that stuff. Dogs get rewarded. And according to tradition, it's because they were quiet when we left Egypt, that they didn't growl at us when we left Egypt. They didn't growl at us as we left in the Exodus. So they get rewarded by getting all of our scraps. So we're going to finish up with this last chapter here today. And we're definitely coming to an end. There's so many laws in this. You must not carry false rumors. You shall not join hands with the guilty to act as a malicious witness. You shall neither side with the mighty to do wrong. You shall not give perverse testimony in a dispute so as to pervert it in favor of the mighty. Nor shall you show deference to a poor man in his dispute. And again, this is an idea that, again, doesn't matter if you're rich or poor. You don't go overboard to protect the poor. If they're wrong, they're wrong. Again, we sometimes forget that in today's society. We also forget, again, that people who have a lot of money are not entitled to a different set of laws. They don't get away because they have better lawyers or because they have more power. There's one law for everybody. And again, it's responsible for the community as a whole to enforce justice. When you encounter your enemy's ox or ass or wandering, you must take it back to him. So that makes sense, right? You have to return property. When you see the ass of your enemy, even though lying under its burden and would have refrained from raising it, you must nevertheless raise it with him. So you have to take care of animals. Even if it's someone you don't like, you don't take it out on the animal. Again, I understand you don't want to help somebody who you don't like, but you're not hurting the person only, you're hurting the animal, and that's not acceptable. Again, it goes to these laws that protect animals that we've read about. Animals like dogs, animals like your domestic animals. And again, animals that are going to gore or are going to hurt you, got to put them down. But you also have to take care of animals and show them compassion. You shall not subvert the rights of your needy in their disputes, right? You cannot let poor people suffer. Keep far from a false charge. Do not bring death on those who are innocent and in the right. I will not acquit the wrongdoer. So God is going to avenge those things. If people are innocently being charged and innocently being arrested and punished, I'm going to enforce it. God says, I am going to punish those people for doing it. Do not take bribes, for bribes blind the clear-sighted and upset the plea of those who are in the right. So this idea is, again, bribes blind. So, we use the image of justice being blind. We say, no, on the contrary, justice shouldn't be blind. Justice should be able to see everything. And blind justice is not justice that can see things. We want everybody to see things. Bribes blind people. No blind justice, and nothing that could make someone not enforce justice equally. You shall not oppress a stranger, for you know the feelings of a stranger, having yourselves been strangers in the land of Egypt. 6 years you shall sow your land and gather in its yield, but in the 7th you shall let it rest and lie fallow. Let the needy among your people eat of it. What they leave the fields, the beasts shall eat. Again, You shall do the same with your vineyards and your olive groves. You have to take care of the needy by letting them be able to have that food that you lie in the sabbatical year. So even before we get the laws of the sabbatical year, fully, which we get in the book of Leviticus, it says, and here in Exodus, this is what you do. Later on, we get much more detail. But what's it for? It's to let the land rest, but also so the poor can be taken care of during that time, and that the animals, once again, the wild beasts even can eat it, because you have a responsibility not just to your domesticated animals, but to the animals that are out there in the wild. You shall do the same with your vineyards and olive groves. Again, all your property can be a place where animals can live and feed. 6 days you shall do your work, but on the seventh day you shall cease from your labor, in order that your ox and your ass may rest, and that your bondman and the stranger may be refreshed. Again, this idea that Shabbat is also for animals. And you can see that is a prevailing idea in this chapter, really, is that animals also are protected. Animals are protected by Jewish law. Compassion for them, making sure they're not being abused, and making sure that they also enjoy Shabbat. We read that in the Ten Commandments, but here we get it again in Mishpatim. Be on guard, all that I've told you. Make no mention of the names of other gods. They shall not be heard on your lips. So again, this idea that you don't even talk about these other gods. And there are people who are very strict about that. They don't even like talking about idolatry or pagan religion. They don't like learning about, there's Orthodox Jews that never wanted to learn about Greek mythology, because even though we know those aren't gods anymore, they don't want to be in that realm, because the Torah says you're not even supposed to talk about idol worship. You're not supposed to talk about those kinds of things, even though people don't do them anymore. Say better not even to talk about them. So there are people who don't engage in that as literature. You shall observe the feast of unleavened bread, or 3 times a year you shall hold a festival. You shall observe the feast of unleavened bread, eating unleavened bread for 7 days as I've commanded you, at the set time in the month of Aviv, next month, 6 weeks from now. For in it you went forth from Egypt, and none shall appear before me empty-handed. So this is the law of, again, Passover. And it's not just now a feast of unleavened bread, but it also is a festival to God. And it is about offering sacrifices on those. And the feast of the harvest, or the first fruits of your work, or what you sow in the field, and the feast of ingathering at the end of the year, when you gather in the results from your field. This is Shavuot and Sukkot. These are the holidays of bringing your first fruits, your offerings, and you're going to come and you're going to bring them and celebrate with God. 3 times a year, all your males shall appear before the sovereign, the Lord. You shall not offer the blood of my sacrifice with anything leavened, and the fat of my festal offering shall be not left, right? Not leave it till the morning. It's not left overnight. It's not left just out for people to look at. The choice fruits, first fruits of your soil, you shall bring to the house of the Lord. You shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk. And that is the first time that we get that law. We get it 3 times in the Bible. This is the first use of it. And this is the law. Again, people derive not to eat milk and meat. It definitely seems to be here in the context where we first see it, is it has to do with the offerings that were being brought. It seems to be, again, a pagan practice, something that the pagans did, that they would literally boil a kid in its own mother's milk, which seemed to be, again, from our standpoint, I think for most logical people would say that that is a abomination, a perversion of God's creation. That's literally, it's one thing to eat the animal, but it's another thing to actually boil it in its own mother's milk. It is the absolute kind of like saying that it's perverting life. And so it was considered to be, again, something we don't do. Again, we derive from it not having milk and meat in any ways, but again, here it seems to be pretty much in the context of the offerings, and that you offer up the best things to God, but there are weird corollaries to that, which are, again, while that might seem like you're doing something really holy to God and that we're offering up milk, a milk sacrifice, that's not right. That's taking it to a level that doesn't seem to make sense. I'm sending an angel before you to guard you on the way, and to bring you to the place I've already made ready. Pay heed to him and obey him. Do not defy him, for he will not pardon your offenses, since my name is in him. But if you obey him and do all I say, I will be an enemy to your enemy and a foe to your foes. So again, this idea that that God is protecting the people on their way, that the laws are gonna be there for protecting them, and you need to follow them, and you'll be protected as long as you do it. When my angel goes before you and brings you to the Amorites and the Hittites, and the Perizzites and the Canaanites and the Hivites and the Jebusites, and I annihilate them, you shall not bow down to their gods and worship or follow their practices, but you shall tear down and smash their pillars to bits. You shall serve the Lord your God, and he will bless your bread and your water, and I will remove sickness from your midst. So again, this idea that when you come into this land, God's going to bring you there. I'm going to take care of you, but don't follow the practices of the people who lived there before. Don't let their altars stay up. Tear them down. And of course, we know that that's not what happened. They let those altars continue, and they engaged in worship. They engaged in these horrific practices of the pagans, which even included, as we know, child sacrifice. So God had a very strict reason for people not having this continue, and of course they did. No women in your land shall miscarry or be barren. I will let you enjoy the full count of your days. I will send forth my terror before you, and I will throw into panic all the people among whom you come, and I will make your enemies turn tail before you. I will send a plague ahead of you, and it shall drive out the Hivites, the Canaanites, and Hittites. I will not drive them out before you in a single year, lest the land become desolate, and the wild beasts multiply to your hurt. So God says, I'm not going to get rid of them all at once, because if I do, then the land's going to go crazy, and you're going to come in and it's going to be all overgrown. So I'm going to get rid of them little bit by little bit. And these Canaanites have been doing really bad things. You got to obliterate their culture, their theology, because it's literally killing people, killing babies. Get rid of it. But if we get rid of them all at once, the land is going to go crazy. And again, I will drive them out little by little until you've increased and possessed the land. I will set your borders from the Sea of Reeds, from the Red Sea to the Sea of Philistia. So from the Red Sea to the Sea of Philistia, which is another way of saying the Mediterranean. From the wilderness to the Euphrates. So this border of Israel is a huge border. Goes all the way up to the Euphrates, all the way up into Syria. So I will deliver. And there was a time during the time of King David when the land of Israel was all that land. I will deliver the inhabitants of the land into your hands, and you will drive them out before you. You shall make no covenant with them and their gods. They shall not remain in your land, lest they cause you to sin against me. For you will serve their gods, and it will prove a snare to you. So this is all part of the reason why these people have to go, because if they don't go, they will lead you into idolatry. So we are going to get into this last section before we finish up. I know we've gone a little over, but again, these laws are massive. These are massive amounts of laws. And what we're going to get into right now is something in chapter 24, which is not law anymore. So it kind of ends with this, well, up till now, it ends with this law of don't behave like the people that you're coming into, their land. And then we finish with a story. And so this goes back to narrative, and we're going to finish with this today. So I'll read the story. We'll go through the story, and let's take a look at it, everybody. So then he said to Moses, come up to the Lord with Aaron, Nadav, and Abihu, Aaron's two oldest sons, and 70 elders of Israel, and bow low from afar. Moses alone shall come near the Lord, but the others shall not come near, nor shall the people come up with him. Moses went and repeated to the people all the commands of the Lord and all the rules, and all the people answered with one voice, saying, all the things that commanded the Lord, we will do. That's the Na'aseh and Ishma. We will do it. Moses then wrote down all the commands of the Lord. Early in the morning, he set up an altar at the foot of the mountain with 12 pillars for the 12 tribes of Israel. That's what we'd see at Mount Sinai. He designated some young men among the Israelites, and they offered burnt offerings and sacrificed bulls as offerings of well-being to the Lord. Moses took one part of the blood and put it in basins, and the other part of the blood he dashed against the altar. Then he took the record of the covenant and read it out loud before the people. And they said, all that the Lord has spoken, we will faithfully do. Now, it seems as though this covenant is the 10 commandments plus what we just read. So it could be that Mishpatim is an original code, legal code, that includes the 10 commandments, which were heard, and then these other laws of behavior. It could be considered the original covenant, Mishpatim with the 10 commandments. An interesting idea, because as you saw, there are a lot of laws there. And they cover lots of things, ethical behavior, also some religious things, including the holidays, the main holidays, the biblical holidays. So keep that in mind. Then he took a record and said, this is, again, what we're going to do. Moses took the blood and dashed it on the people, the blood on the people. And said, this is the blood of the covenant that the Lord now makes with you concerning all these commands. Then Moses and Aaron, Nadav and Avihu, and the 70 elders ascended, and they saw that the God of Israel. Under his feet there was a likeness of pavement of sapphire. Sapphire. So this kind of blue, like the very sky for purity. Yet he did not raise his hands against the elders of the Israelites. They beheld God and they ate and drank. So they get to see, the elders and Moses and Aaron and Aaron's sons get to see some part of God here. The Lord said to Moses, come up to the mountain, come up to me and wait there, and I will give you stone tablets with the teaching and commandments which I've inscribed to instruct them. So again, this is the Torah. It says Torah and the mitzvot, the Torah and the commandments, the teaching and commandments. So is it the 10 commandments and Torah? That's the way people have derived it. So this is now the 10 commandments, the tablets, but also the Torah, all given at Mount Sinai. So Moses and his attendant Joshua arose, and Moses ascended the mountain of God. To the elders he said, wait here for us until we return to you. You have Aaron and Hur with you. Let anyone who has a legal matter approach them. So Aaron and Hur are going to stay behind and help. When Moses had ascended the mountain, the cloud covered the mountain. The presence of the Lord abode on Mount Sinai, and the cloud hid it for 6 days. On the 7th day, he called to Moses from the midst of the cloud. Now the presence of the Lord appeared in the sight of the Israelites as a consuming fire on the top of the mountain. Moses went inside the cloud and ascended the mountain, and Moses remained on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. So the question of what we see afterwards in Truma and Tetzaveh, all the way until he comes down in the Parsha Ki Tetzeh, maybe that was Moses getting the 10 commandments and the laws. And of course, included in that now will be the laws of building the tabernacle, which we'll read next week in Parshat Truma. And again, sometimes it's read as a double portion with Tetzaveh, but this year we read it as 2 separate portions. So again, everybody, lots of things to think about here. There's a lot of law. There's a lot of basis for, thankfully, for the laws that we still have today. But I will tell you, there's some things that I think we've drifted away from, not least of which is protection for people who are victims of crime, which is a terrifically important thing. It's something that I've talked to my friend. I've introduced a lot of people to Kim Goldman over the years. She's advocated for victims' rights for a long time, and obviously is one of the most famous victims of crime, her family, that never got justice. And so I always think about her when I read these portions of the Torah and Jewish law that deal with justice, and the fact that It's one of the greatest perversions of justice that we've seen on a public level. It's not the worst. I'm not saying there aren't people who've suffered and horrible criminals also. The difference was it was such a public example of law not being enforced, such a travesty, that it was amplified by its obvious and glaring and very public, and the horrible shame that is on all of us for watching it and being, again, partners in the fact that justice couldn't happen for her. So just so you know, as of this moment, as of today, her family has still been set with thousands of dollars of legal bills. Her father, Fred, who's now about 80, almost 80, I think 80 now, has been working for his entire life, and will never really be able to be free of not just the trauma and the loss of losing his son in a murder, but had to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees and deal with that, and never really was able to claim any kind of money from the estate. So I just want you to know, I know the situation. Her son, Sam, who's a wonderful young man who's graduating from high school this year and is going to be going on to college and is a great young man. He celebrated his bar mitzvah with us 5 years ago. He's a great example of someone raised with tragedy who hasn't taken it out on other people, and is hopefully going to be a great success. But I'm telling you, this is a family. I mean, I think people think somehow they were able to make money off of this. To the contrary, they have not had a very easy life financially, and still are remarkably nice and generous and good-hearted people, but victimized to some extent by our society. So I want you to know, these are not people who made money off in any way. On the contrary, it cost them money. So I think about that whenever we read about laws and the enforcement and the lack of enforcement of laws. It upsets me to know that we have examples in our society, in our day, where we've fallen backwards. So on the positive, again, a lot of these laws are part of our society today, and we're grateful for that we live in a country that tries to enforce justice. And we don't always make it, but we try. And we're very blessed that we live in a country like this. So with that, I wish everyone a good night. Please stay safe, and please join us for Shabbos and for Purim coming up. While I was on the computer with you tonight, we just got some of the great videos that we're putting together for the Purim celebration. I promise you, Mark Kaplan's participating. He's done some. Actually, I shouldn't tell you everybody who's doing it, but some great voices, some very talented people that don't normally get to participate, but because we're doing it the way we're doing it this year, I think you're going to be very happy. It's all in-house talent. It's all people from Santa Clarita, but from our temple. But I think you really enjoy it. So I can't wait to look at it. I'm going to get off, and I want to look at it. I get the first look, but I promise you, you'll love it. So I already saw some actually from Wendy. So I can't wait to see it. So everybody stay good, stay healthy. And again, it's great seeing you all, and we'll see you soon, I hope. Thank
you for another
Thank
great.
you, Rabbi.
Take care, everybody. It's great to see you.
Love you, Joyce.
Love you guys.
Love you back.